I want to thank one of our student workers, Ryan Wing, for making that ad. Bonus points if anyone wants to guess who the voiceover voice is. I'll be taking bets after the program. Welcome to the fourth and final program in the Dole Institute's 2009 Presidential Lecture Series, 10 Score, Abraham Lincoln's Legacy. We've already heard from three of the nation's leading Lincoln scholars, writers, and thinkers, and tonight we'll hear from a fourth, who also happens to be one of KU's absolute finest faculty members. It's often pointed out that many of the people who teach right here in Lawrence are much bigger deals nationally and internationally than they appear to be here in our hometown. Tonight's speaker is an excellent example of this. She has spent the years since the publication of her book speaking across the country on Lincoln's political opposition and is a member of the advisory committee for the National Lincoln Bicentennial. If this were not the fourth lecture in our series and I didn't recognize many erudite faces in the audience, I might have had to explain that tonight's lecture is not about Lincoln's relationship with poisonous snakes. I'm sure everyone here knows that Copperheads were a non-venomous and vocal group of Democrats who opposed the Civil War, disagreed with Lincoln, and demanded an immediate peace settlement with the Confederates. Over the past century and a half, historians have never quite gotten around to agreeing on just how serious the Copperhead dissent was, or how much they threatened Lincoln's presidency or leadership in the war. In her book, Copperheads, published by Oxford University Press, Professor Jennifer L. Weber explains just how serious Democratic dissent was. Lincoln himself famously called the Copperhead movement the fire in the rear, suggesting they posed potentially as much of a threat as the Confederates on the front. And throughout the presidential election year of 1864, as the bloody war dragged on, they appeared to be winning. Lincoln was convinced in the summer of that year that he was a political goner, that is, until General Sherman took Atlanta in early September of 1864. The first book-length treatment of the Copperheads in almost 50 years, Weber concludes that anti-war sentiment was widespread and far from a peripheral issue in the North, that war dissent turned neighbor against neighbor, dividing communities and spawning frequent outbreaks of violence, and that war dissent hurt the Union Army's ability to prosecute the war. Furthermore, she argues that these developments led to the politicization of the Union soldiers themselves, who became disgusted with the peace movement and voted for Lincoln and the Republicans in overwhelming numbers. So often when hearing about Lincoln during this bicentennial, we have encountered a man I call Saint Abe, a mythical person who never made a mistake and was always on the correct and winning side. This guy is far less interesting than the flesh and blood human being we'll hear about tonight, a president who knew he made mistakes, was tortured about the bloody war he continued to prosecute, and was forced to develop astonishingly sharp leadership skills to win re-election and bring the war to a successful conclusion, and finish what one of my favorite historians calls the Second American Revolution. Jennifer L. Weber is a graduate of Northwestern University, where she graduated with a journalism degree in 1984. She went on to work as a reporter and later as a political aide in the California State Legislature. A lifelong interest in the Civil War eventually spurred her to pursue an academic career, and she earned an MA in history at Cal State Sacramento before ending up, as many of us do, at Princeton, where she studied under James M. McPherson. Her dissertation won the 2005 Hay Nicolay Prize for the best graduate work related to Abraham Lincoln. We were lucky enough to get her to join our merry band in the KU History Department, a point in which I take a certain amount of pride since I was the chair of the search committee. She's currently at work on a children's book about the Battle of Gettysburg and a collection of essays in honor of a teacher we both shared and greatly admire, Professor McPherson. I know many of you in this audience heard Jim when he spoke on Lincoln here in the winter of 2005, and I'm sure you'll think just as highly of his distinguished student who will speak here tonight. I'm pleased to welcome my friend and colleague to the stage. Welcome, Jennifer Weber.
There we can. Okay, can you hear me in the back? Great, hi. Well, thank you all very much for coming out tonight, and hello Kansas to the rest of you who are out there watching this on the internet or whatever. It is great to see you all out here for Lincoln's Bicentennial. I've been able to come to a couple of the other talks, which I think have been absolutely fantastic, and so it's a real joy and a privilege to be here tonight in the company of these other very, very fine historians who have been speaking in this series. Well, I'm going to start, much like Lincoln did, with a story. This is Lincoln's bicentennial year. And as John said, I've been traveling around the country this year, giving a lot of talks and what have you. Well, last month, for Lincoln's birthday, I was in Springfield, Illinois, which was just great fun. And at the bicentennial event there, they were handing out pins with pennies. Lincoln's pennies, with Lincoln's face showing out that you were supposed to put in your lapel pin. The Copperheads got their name from the Republicans. It was not a title that the Copperheads particularly wanted or liked. At the time, it was not foisted upon them with any fondness. It was, in fact, the idea of these poisonous snakes in the grass. That's what the Republicans said that the Peace Democrats were. Well, as it turned out, at the same time, Copperhead was also a term for the penny at the time. And on one side of the penny was the head of Lady Liberty. Now, one of the things that the Copperheads were very interested in, said they were defending, were civil liberties. They were very concerned about what they regarded as Lincoln's encroachment on civil liberties and his abuse of power. And so they would take the copperhead, the penny, and they would make pins of them with the head of Lady Liberty pointing out, and they would wear this around in their lapels. So you can imagine how vastly amused I was last month in Springfield, Illinois, when the thing that they were giving out to celebrate Lincoln's bicentennial was a copperhead with Lincoln's face on it instead of Lady Liberty's. I thought this was intensely amusing. The state historian of Illinois found it not so much. But I think he's gotten over that. At any rate, there was strong opposition to the Civil War in the North. And it was there from the very beginning of the war, from the firing on Fort Sumter. Anti-war Democrats, who were strict constructionists on the Constitution, objected to nearly everything that Abraham Lincoln did to wage war, from raising troops to suspending habeas corpus to ordering a blockade of southern ports and virtually declaring war on the South, which was, of course, a congressional prerogative. By the time Congress met in July of 1861 for a special session, anxious conservatives thought Lincoln was out to usurp American liberties and was well on his way to becoming a tyrant, a term they would use for him through the whole war, tyrant. In his message to Congress, Lincoln explained himself, saying that he had no choice but to call out the war power of the government once the Union had been fired upon. He defended his call for troops by reminding Congress that Northerners had demanded that he do that. Besides, he assumed Congress would ratify it, as it very quickly did. Without specifically mentioning Roger Taney, Lincoln argued against the Chief Justice's ruling in Ex parte Merriman, which held that Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus was unconstitutional. Lincoln pointed out to Congress that laws were not being enforced in a third of the states and said he had to impose federal authority. The administration couldn't protect habeas corpus if the government were overthrown, he said, and should not protect habeas corpus if doing so would threaten the government's continued existence. This message established Lincoln's pattern for dealing with the political opposition. The Copperheads were, of course, his most virulent critics. Lincoln addressed their complaints, but he never mentioned them by name, either as individuals or as a group. His response to Copperheads illustrates many of the traits that make him a superb president, but these same traits could just as easily have ended Lincoln's presidency and resulted in historians, like me, dismissing him as a dismal failure. Contingency, it turns out, is as important a factor in Lincoln's enduring legacy as are his own immense gifts as a politician and a leader. Now, Lincoln rarely spoke to or even alluded to the Peace Democrats. At times, he would refer to Copperhead charges and try to counter them, but not often. In not confronting his political enemies, Lincoln was playing a dangerous game. On the one hand, he didn't add weight to their arguments by dignifying them. On the other, by offering little in the way of rebuttal and even less in the way of direct engagement, he often seemed to cede the field to his foes. When the Union armies weren't performing well, especially in the summers of 1862 and 64, Lincoln's silence gave Democrats in particular an excuse to switch their allegiance from the war wing of their party to the peace wing. Lincoln's laconism is all the more striking given the bare-knuckled political style of the day. A moderate by nature, Lincoln may have maintained as politically neutral a pose as was possible, in hopes of keeping the war Democrats on board. One historian has argued that the Republican Party tried to equate itself with unionism and patriotism during the war by stressing nonpartisanship. Lincoln had some early successes in this vein, naming Democrats to his cabinet, as we all know from reading the papers of late, and gaining the support of prominent Democrats such as Stephen Douglas. But, as is so often the case in politics, for Republicans at this time, nonpartisanship was really a one-way street. Nonpartisan to them meant Republican. They made little effort to accommodate Democratic interests in public policy and were very quick to paint anyone who did not agree with them as a traitor. Credible claims of bipartisanship really began to fray in the fall of 1862, after the dismal military losses of that summer and Lincoln's announcing the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Democrats, and especially the Copperheads, made notable gains in the off-year congressional elections that November. And by January of 1863, you heard loud rumblings of secession coming from Lincoln's own section, the Old Northwest. Lincoln told a senator, and John said this earlier, he worried more about what he called the fire in the rear than the enemy to the front. Now let me just tell you a little bit here. At one point, I was thinking about calling this book The Fire in the Rear. Because it is the custom of, many Civil War historians to quote Lincoln in the title, and I thought that was a good idea, and it was a Lincoln quote, and then I told my friends, and they quickly disabused me of this idea, and so it is not the title of my book, you'll notice. But Lincoln was very worried that what he was going to have here was a two-front war. He was going to have a hot military war to his front, and he was going to have this cold war for hearts and minds to his back, and that may actually also burst into a hot war. He was very worried about this. So that's January of 1863. There's serious talk of what is now the Midwest seceding from the Union. Resistance only gets worse. And you see that coming really in March of 1863 with the draft. Now, I would argue that conscription is the greatest power the federal government has. Now, other people may say no, it's capital punishment. But in theory, at least, if you are subject to the death penalty, you have been tried and found guilty. You're put to death because you're guilty of doing something bad. A draft claims the innocent as well as the wicked. You can still die for having done nothing at all, other than be more or less in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this marked the first draft in American history, a huge explosion of government power reaching deep, deep, deep into the countryside, the way Americans had never experienced before. Huge, huge resistance to this. But in the middle of this, the remarkable thing is that Lincoln seems to have had very few conversations with friends or advisors about the Copperheads or what to do about them. The most that he seems to be talking about the Peace Democrats is via a book that he read. He loved to read this out loud. He'd tip his chair back, he'd put his feet on his desk, and he'd read out of something called the Nasby Papers, which was a satire of this barely literate Copperhead in Ohio and his various misadventures. Lincoln thought this was absolutely hilarious, and it was in that context that he mostly talked about the Copperheads. Well, he may not have said much about the anti-war Democrats, but he certainly was prepared to act against them quickly and forcefully if he needed to. He sent money and troops to areas that seemed at risk from their influence. He suspended habeas corpus, first in limited areas and then across the entire country. When he thought 2 New York newspapers had committed treasonous acts, he ordered their editors and publishers to be arrested immediately. While he may not have been personally responsible for the most egregious violations of civil liberties, Lincoln endorsed many of the actions taken on behalf of his administration and consistently defended their constitutionality, claiming that they were in the best interests of public safety during a rebellion, which was a quote that he lifted practically directly from the U.S. Constitution. Well, one of the interesting facets of this is that there is almost no contact directly between Lincoln and the peacemen. In fact, Lincoln communicated directly with his critics just twice. Both came in 1863 with the arrest of former Congressman Clement Vallandigham, who was the nation's foremost / most notorious Copperhead. He was arrested for speaking out against the administration. He was arrested on charges of treason, and he was captured, as it were, in his house at about 2 o'clock in the morning, spirited onto a train from Dayton to Columbus, Ohio, where he was tried by a military tribunal, found guilty, and sentenced to spend the rest of the war in a military prison. Now, this was a civilian and a guy who had just lost his seat in Congress the previous November. The general who ordered all this, Ambrose Burnside, did this without Lincoln's knowledge or consent. And Lincoln was suddenly faced with a real problem. People on both sides of the aisle were furious about this arrest because it looked like this congressman was being arrested for exercising his free speech rights. And so what Lincoln does is he splits the difference. He can't undermine his general, and he doesn't want to make Vallandigham a martyr. So he decides, okay, Vallandigham, you like the South so much, we'll send you there. And that's what he does. He commutes the sentence to banishment to the Confederacy. And as it turns out, Vallandigham didn't like the Confederates so much, and they didn't like him, and he was there for about a month when everybody reached the mutual agreement that it would be best for him to leave and go to Canada. And so he spends the next year or so in Canada running, among other things, running for the governor of Ohio. And the whole time he's in Canada, by the way, there are Union gunboats. He's in Windsor, Ontario, which is right across the Detroit River from Detroit, of all places. And there are two Union gunboats, that are permanently parked in the middle of the Detroit River with their guns trained on Vallandingham's front parlor for as long as he's there. So that's the story of Clement Vallandingham. Well, as I said, lots of people in the North were very upset about this. And of most particular interest to us are two petitions that Lincoln gets in the weeks after Vallandingham's arrest from conservative Democrats. Now, one is a group from Albany, and the other is from Ohio. And they're both objecting strongly to Vallandingham's arrest. Lincoln sees this as an opportunity to talk about Vallandingham's case and about the larger Copperhead fears about civil liberties and his own claims to expanded powers as commander-in-chief. Now, we can read Lincoln's words in two ways. One, as an example of his trying to reason with and reach out to the opposition, or as his subtly undermining the peacemen's cause and raising serious questions about their loyalties. And this is one of the things that we see often with Lincoln, is that his language is ambiguous enough to be read multiple ways, depending on your point of view. But that is what's going on in these two particular letters. Let's start with the first one. This is the letter to the Albany group. Lincoln's very polite through the whole letter. He says that he, like they, sought to maintain the government. He defended the military arrests of civilians, pointing out that the Constitution allowed the suspension of habeas corpus in cases of rebellion or invasion. And that's the phrase in the Constitution, in cases of rebellion or invasion. To Lincoln, this looks like a pretty clear-cut case. He had adopted stronger measures only gradually and when they were indispensable to public safety. He reminded the Democrats that their own hero, Andrew Jackson, maintained martial law in New Orleans even after the War of 1812 was over. And then he went on to cast these subtle aspersions on his correspondence. By objecting to military arrests, he said, they had fallen into a very clever Confederate trap. At the time of secession, the rebels calculated that they could rely on Union guarantees of free speech and habeas corpus to protect what Lincoln termed a most efficient corps of spies, informers, suppliers, and aiders and abettors of their cause in 1,000 ways. Raising constitutional questions confused Northerners enough to buy Confederates time, which was critical in what had become a war of attrition. Lincoln impugned the Democrats' loyalties here by suggesting that they were aiding the rebel cause, whether by accident or intent. As for Vallandingham, he wasn't arrested because of what he said, according to Lincoln. That would be unconstitutional. He was arrested because he was trying to prevent troops from being raised and encouraging desertion. That left the nation underprotected. Had Vallandingham not been damaging the military power of the country, Lincoln said he would be happy to correct the problem. But the crux of the issue was this, and this quote is probably something you've heard before. Must I shoot a simple-minded soldier boy who deserts, while I must not touch the hair of a wily agitator who induces him to desert? I think that in such a case, to silence the agitator and save the boy is not only constitutional, but withal a great mercy. At the end of his letter, Lincoln said that he could not help but notice that the New York petitioners had identified themselves as Democrats and not as American citizens. Lincoln said that he found this show of partisanship to be incredibly disappointing. Now, his allusion to party here, and in fact, the very fact of the letter itself, marked a dramatic change for the president. Under intense fire from the increasingly influential Copperheads, and still reeling from Joseph Hooker's devastating loss at Chancellorsville, Lincoln abandoned any pretense of nonpartisanship or bipartisan unity that he had maintained publicly until now. He was becoming much more assertive in dealing with the opposition. And we see that even more in a couple of weeks when Lincoln wrote his letter to the Ohio Democratic State Convention. Unlike the New Yorkers, the Buckeyes never specifically said that they supported military force in response to the rebellion. Lincoln noted this. He also noted that they appeared to be not even conscious of an existing rebellion being in progress with the avowed object of destroying the Union. That, combined with their nominating Vallandigham for governor, made the Ohio men complicit in encouraging draft dodging and desertion, and in offering comfort to the enemy. Lincoln told the Ohioans that if they would agree to a set of resolutions that he laid out and sign them, he would allow Vallandigham to come back from Canada. His offer was a trap, a very clever one, but still a trap. It's heads I win, tails you lose. If the Buckeyes signed, he had a promise of cooperation. If they didn't, they looked less than loyal. The snare was obvious, even to the Ohioans, and they tried to sidestep it by saying they had no authority to bargain with the president over Vallandingham's status. And that was the last they heard from Lincoln. After this, the president's allusions to the Copperheads are far less conciliatory. Lincoln may have realized that he could not change their minds, or he may have lost all patience with them after the bloody draft riots that plagued the summer of 1863. His fatalistic streak, this strong sense that he always had that he could not change the course of history, also could explain his hardening stance toward the opposition. In any case, his changing attitude was certainly part of what David Donald, Lincoln historian, has called an increasingly ruthless determination on Lincoln's part to prosecute this war. From this point on, Lincoln seems far more inclined to needle the Copperheads than to try to cooperate with them in any sort of a way. That brings us now to September of 1863. He writes a letter to James Conkling, an old friend of his from Springfield, Illinois, that he wants Conkling to read at a gathering there. And this letter is a prime example of Lincoln's new attitude toward the opposition. He began by addressing the Copperheads' persistent calls for an end to the war. Peace, by his reckoning, could be had in only one of three ways. Northerners could win the war militarily. They could give up the Union, or they could compromise with the rebels. If Democrats wanted to give up the Union, they should just say so. A peace deal was a complete fantasy. That left only a military solution as far as Lincoln was concerned. But he did not think that war was the central issue for the Peace Democrats. He thought race was the main issue for them. And in fact, even by the standards of their own times, Copperheads were virulently racist. I mean, what they were saying would just peel the paint off the side of a barn. It was awful. The Emancipation Proclamation had absolutely infuriated the Peace Democrats, who thought that Lincoln had reached far beyond his constitutional limits in issuing it. And this had really ignited their wrath. So Lincoln addresses this with a series of propositions. And Lincoln, remember, is nothing if not a logician. And here we see this in action. Were slaves not by definition property? And had not property always been a fair target in war? If one endorsed the idea of human property and confiscating property was legitimate in wartime, then the Emancipation Proclamation made perfect sense as a war measure. But Lincoln saved his most cutting remarks for a conversation on military service. He all but accused stay-at-home dissidents of cowardice, which was a pretty serious thing to accuse somebody of in the 1860s. You say you will not fight to free Negroes. Some of them seem to be willing to fight for you, he said, in what I only read as a mocking tone. He pointed out that having black men in uniform meant that fewer whites would have to serve. But blacks, like whites, act upon motives. In this case, the motive was the promise of freedom. And the promise being made must be kept, Lincoln said. As for Copperhead assertions that they were loyal Unionists, Lincoln suggested, prove it. Fight for the Union now and worry about emancipation later once the nation had been saved. Now, this was another rather wily challenge on Lincoln's part, given that Peace Democrats rarely volunteered for military service despite their repeated claims of patriotism. And this brings us to Lincoln's conclusion, which was a withering and racially charged indictment of the peace movement. When the Union won the war, he predicted, there will be some black men who can remember that with silent tongue and clenched teeth and steady eye and well-poised bayonet, they have helped mankind on to this great consummation. While I fear there will be some white ones unable to forget that with malignant heart and deceitful speech, they have strove to hinder it. Now, this was the closest that Lincoln himself ever came to accusing the opposition of treason. Lincoln's commitment to emancipation was unqualified after the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And it illustrates several important points about him and his characteristics as a leader. First, he did not move quickly on the topic of emancipation or anything else. He listened to many, many different points of view. This helps account for his uncanny sense for the mood of the country. Remember, this is 80 years before the first Gallup poll. But Lincoln had a remarkable sense for where the country was. And it's because he had what he called public opinion baths. Anybody could just come visit Lincoln in his office, have a few minutes with him, say their piece, and leave. And this allowed Lincoln to hear a lot about what was going on in the country with everyday people, and not just the members of Congress on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. Lincoln's major actions consistently placed him just ahead of public opinion, allowing him to lead, but not so far out there, not so far ahead of his people that he would lose his followers. He did not act on emancipation immediately after the war began, but a year and a half into it, when he realized that Southern Unionists were not going to rise up against the Confederate government, and that the North needed to attack the soft underbelly of the South, and that there was a growing recognition among people in the North that this is what needed to happen to prosecute this war successfully. Even so, even after he had written out the preliminary proclamation, he stuck it in his desk drawer for 2 months, waiting for something he could claim as a victory, Antietam, so that he could issue the proclamation from a position of strength and not one of weakness. Okay, other characteristics: silence, secrecy. Now, these were things that people who had known Lincoln his adult life were very, very familiar with. William Herndon, who had been Lincoln's law partner for years, called Lincoln the most shut-mouthed man he'd ever known. This habit of his of non-disclosure could really rankle observers, including his friends, but it gave Lincoln a lot of flexibility. Until he had made some sort of pronouncement, he could do anything. He had not committed himself in any particular way, so he could keep his options open. The consequence of this was events generally did not overtake him. Again, he stayed out in front. His silence had another advantage, which is that there was less to divide Northerners. Lincoln understood that he was a divisive figure, and if he held his tongue, there would be less for Northerners to snipe at or argue about, and he could keep more of them on board. Now, once his mind was made up, Lincoln was often immovable, especially on what he saw as critical issues such as emancipation. Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862 to a public and an army that were deeply divided as to its wisdom and its constitutionality. As I said before, conservative Democrats were absolutely apoplectic over this, although it did give them the benefit of being able to say that they were right all along, that this really was a war for emancipation and had been since its very inception, despite what Lincoln said. But Lincoln refused to back down. Lincoln refused to back down even after these not-so-good congressional elections of November of 1862. When his old friend, Orville Hickman Browning, advised Lincoln to drop emancipation after those elections, Lincoln would not do it. And in fact, he, in a very peevish manner, denied that the Emancipation Proclamation had had anything to do with the outcome of the elections anyway. Lincoln insisted that emancipation was the only way to win this war because it denied the South its labor force while giving moral authority to the Northern cause. Now, the Army came around relatively quickly on the subject of emancipation. Really, the Army was well on board to this idea by April of 1863. But emancipation remained a politically dodgy issue for Lincoln as late as the summer of 1864. And this really had a lot to do with war weariness, which by that time was really reaching a crescendo. Copperhead calls for an armistice, an immediate end to the war, go to the negotiating table. We're gaining a very broad audience by the summer of 1864, and this audience included not just the usual suspects, but also war Democrats and even Republicans. who were sick and tired of the bloodshed. They had had enough and wanted to make it end. Many Northerners, Republican and Democrat, blamed Lincoln's insistence on emancipation for the bloody war dragging on and on and on. By August, his political prospects appeared to be nil, and jittery party leaders urged Lincoln to back off his support for emancipation. Republican Party leaders told Lincoln to back off emancipation. This was a party that had been founded 10 years earlier on an explicit anti-slavery platform. This is an extraordinary moment. They wanted to win. They wanted to hold on to power. Drop it. Drop emancipation. Let it go. And Lincoln thought about it. Lincoln wrote a memo authorizing somebody to go down to Richmond and talk with Jefferson Davis and find out what would happen if Lincoln dropped emancipation as an explicit war aim. And he slept on it overnight, and he took that letter and he put it in his desk drawer. He said he would be damned in time and eternity if he went forward with that, if he abandoned the freedmen, if he gave up on them, if he reneged on his promises to them. He also thought he would be putting the military effort in jeopardy if there were any threat of re-enslavement, because by that time there were 180,000 African Americans in the Union Army. By this time, Lincoln was convinced he would be turned out of office. And he told a senator, "We'll go down with our principles. I will not modify, qualify, nor retract my proclamation." In other words, he would rather be right than president. Now, Lincoln may have been flexible coming toward a decision, but he stood fast once it was made. This characteristic led him to insist on emancipation and unconditional surrender, even when Northerners were howling for peace. He continued to back Ulysses S. Grant as the general in charge of all the Union armies after the public had soured on the man they now called Grant the Butcher. Grant had taken 64,000 casualties in 6 weeks in the spring of 1864, and Northerners just didn't have the stomach for this anymore. Lincoln took full responsibility for his decisions, with Grant and with everything else. Noah Brooks, who was a newspaperman who later would serve as Lincoln's secretary, said that Lincoln did not care what the political costs of his most important decisions were. With him, the question was not, is it convenient? Is it expedient? But is it right? And here we see in Lincoln a man who has the courage of his convictions. Nevertheless, his mulishness on key issues, along with his frontier background, made him the object of intense criticism. And here we see another characteristic of him. He has amazingly thick skin. I mean, really, it's quite extraordinary. He takes almost nothing personally. Now, that's not to say he's going to read every single thing that criticizes him. He does ask his secretaries to screen out things that may make him angry, because he does not think that that's a good use of his energy. It pulls him away from the war, and that is not what he wants to happen. But when he did hear the assaults against him, he took very little personally and never engaged in recrimination. And here I think that he is quite possibly, at least the only president I can think of off the top of my head, who is not inclined to retribution against his enemies. His patience is just remarkable. His restraint and his forgiveness again and again and again trump his anger. And repeatedly, he writes these sharply worded letters and then sticks them in his desk drawer, saying, I guess we won't talk about that now. And the reason we know about these letters is because his secretaries found them in that desk drawer after his assassination. Now, any evaluation of Lincoln's leadership has to account for contingency. Lincoln and his presidency, by any measure, came very close to being a failure. If Sherman had not taken Atlanta before the election, I think Lincoln would have lost in 1864. Without Lincoln, emancipation would surely have been off the table. And I think it's quite possible that the Union itself may have followed. Historians would blame Lincoln's leadership style for the Union's defeat, just the way they blame Jefferson Davis's leadership for the Confederacies. Historians would say Lincoln was too secretive, too stubborn, too inflexible, too willing to stick with poor generals for too long, too unwilling to change course, even when the country demanded it. Many of the leadership characteristics that we credit him for, that we argue made him great, could equally have been blamed for his downfall had Atlanta not fallen in September of 1864. But Sherman did take Atlanta. And then Phil Sheridan swept through the Shenandoah Valley later that month, stripping it bare. Those victories helped turn public sentiment around in the North, and of course, as we know, Lincoln won the election handily. Copperheads, after that, all but went into hiding. With his death, Lincoln then became the martyr president, someone nearly on par with Jesus to many Americans, both then and now. Lincoln was, in fact, a man of vision. He was a remarkably gifted politician, and I use politician in the best sense of the word. Roland Burris is making this harder and harder for me to make this case, but I think politicians can do amazing things and do great things in their offices. And Lincoln was a great politician in the best sense of the word and the possibilities that that word holds. He had a capacity in an age long before polling to sense the public mood and stay just ahead of it. He led his people, not they him. But his faith in them and their wisdom was unshakable. His determination to protect his promise of emancipation was an act of real political courage. But as a historical actor, he was the beneficiary of contingency, of timing. He was reelected because Election Day came after important Union victories in the fall of 1864, rather than in the bleak days of August. His death, a tragedy by any measure, coming just days after Robert E. Lee's surrender sealed his legacy. Lincoln did not have to confront the whole of Reconstruction. He unquestionably would have done a better job than his successor, but so would my cat. Johnson was such a disaster. But had Lincoln not been assassinated, he still would have faced a considerable challenge of dealing with these balky Southern elites on the one hand and the angry radical Republicans on the other. Instead, as we know, he was shot on Good Friday. He died in the moment of his greatest glory, frozen in time, leaving us to contemplate him amid a cloud of persistent what-ifs. Thanks very much. We're doing a Q&A. They're going to walk around with a microphone. Anybody who has any questions, just raise your hand and he'll come around with the mic.
Had Lincoln been turned out in the election of 1864, do you think he might have tried to re-enter politics or come back in and try to run again, or what would his political future have been?
Zero. No, he would have been completely discredited at that point, I think. Oh, just a moment. He's coming with the mic.
Were there state militias that were active at this time, and how did they come down on the division?
On which division?
Within the states.
Okay. Yes, there were state militias. In fact, the way that troops were raised initially in the war was state by state, and it was sort of, in theory, a militia, raising the militia. These regiments would bear a number from a particular state, like the 30th Illinois or something. And that is the way that the troops were raised and organized until 1863. Now, what changes in 1863 is the federal government is in charge of raising troops, not the governor. But they're still raised in the states, and they still have these state number, the 30th Illinois, for instance. They still have these number designations for that particular state. How they come down on the question of what Lincoln is doing, the volunteers in the first 2 years of the war are entirely supportive of Lincoln, where you get a lot more, a much broader range of opinion as once the draft starts. But even so, a lot of people who were drafted were able to buy their way out or hire a substitute to fill in for them. And so, a lot of people who didn't believe in the war just never served. Okay. Yep.
What were the repercussions of the draft riots? I mean, it seems that riots in this country, there's a long history of riots in this country, and they usually turn public opinion against them. Mm-hmm. Was that the case with these riots, especially the New York? But I mean, and were there others? Because I don't know any others besides the New York draft riots. So what was the impact of those on the Copperheads and on the peace movement?
Well, the New York riot started as a draft riot and very quickly turned into a race riot, and I think that it really did leave a lot of people with a pretty bad taste in their mouth about the Copperheads. But it's easy to do that, to take that position as well when the Union armies are winning. And once again, it's how the armies are doing that is really the most important single factor. But yeah, the Copperheads do burn through some of their credibility, and particularly the governor of New York, I think, it takes a major blow to his credibility, especially among Republicans. He was a Copperhead, and he did not acquit himself well during the riots at all or afterward. And so he probably took the hardest blow of any single person. And there were other riots. They were kind of all over the North. The last riot of note really came in March of 1864 in one of the towns that Lincoln and Douglas had a debate in. A couple here.
Was there ever any movement to make it illegal to pay someone to serve in your place?
Not during the Civil War, no. No, it was written into the law that that was an option. So it was perfectly legal to do that, strangely enough.
Could you name the 13 or so Confederate States and how their leadership was formed to be united against the Union Army?
Do you want me to go through every one of them? That would take a little bit of time. Let me just say, it was 11 states. And the first 7 go out starting just before Christmas. South Carolina is the first to secede in December of 1860, and the 6 others follow very quickly. What they're reacting to is the outcome of the 1860 election. They don't like the fact that a Republican was elected. They see him as a sectional candidate, and in fact he did not get any electoral votes from a southern state. They take their marbles and go home. They don't like the election, they go home and break off. The next 4 states, the most notable of which is Virginia, leave after Fort Sumter. And the sense there is that they're acting in sympathy with their fellow southern states. So to condense it down very briefly, that pretty much summarizes the motivations of these states that leave in 2 waves.
Could you address the relationship of Lincoln and General McClellan and McClellan's relationship to the Copperheads, please?
Is that you, Ed?
Yeah.
Okay, Lincoln and McClellan. Oh, golly, I could go on for quite a while about that. Lincoln and McClellan have a pretty fraught relationship, more from McClellan's point of view, I think, than Lincoln's. Lincoln says, you know, if he can win, I'll hold his horse. He'll do anything for McClellan if McClellan will just win. McClellan, for reasons that I don't think anybody's really been able to explain comprehensively, McClellan doesn't fight. And he seems to have been really unstrung by the first real battle that he was in, and he did not want to see bodies. He did not want to see wounded men. He had a great attachment to his army, and he did not want to see it damaged. And so he's constantly telegraphing Lincoln, saying that he doesn't have enough men, he doesn't have enough horses, he's vastly outnumbered, and it's one excuse after the other. And Lincoln finally just has it with his excuses after excuses after excuses for not fighting and not chasing Lee, not pursuing him aggressively, and finally cuts him in November of '62, so after Antietam. McClellan and the Copperheads, McClellan was a war Democrat, even though there was no love lost between him and Lincoln. He was a war Democrat. He felt that, the Democrats had their convention in 1864 at the end of August. They broke up just a couple days before Atlanta fell, which is probably the worst case of timing in American political history. Because what they had done was they had written this platform. Vallandigham had come back, and he was helping to write the platform. He was instrumental. And he wrote a plank to the platform calling the war a failure and demanding an immediate cessation of hostilities. Well, when Atlanta falls, this looks terrible for the Democrats. They look, the Republicans say they have the smell of treason about their clothes. And McClellan is the Democratic candidate, and this is a complete albatross as far as he's concerned. And he writes draft after draft after draft of acceptance letter, of trying to patch over this thing that is their platform, and he can't do it. He cannot do it. But he had indicated over the summer that if he won, that he would let the South go. And he would have been under tremendous pressure, again, had he won, from the peace element of his party, which was almost as strong as the war element. He would have had a very strong or very difficult time holding them off. And frankly, I'm not sure he had the moral fortitude to do it. I think he might have let the Union go.
Yes, could you comment on the major significance of the Emancipation Proclamation, because it was designed to apply only to the states that had seceded. They were taking orders from Jefferson Davis, not from Abraham Lincoln. But how do you evaluate the major significance of it?
Okay, I would say it, two or three things here. One, now the Union has two war aims. One is reunion, the other is emancipation. It brings a moral dimension to the war that was missing beforehand. The important consequence of that moral dimension is that that keeps the European powers out of the war. Up until Antietam, in fact, right before Antietam, there were serious discussions between the French and the British about recognizing the Confederacy. And the Prime Minister of Britain said, let's wait until this next battle, till we see how it shakes out. And that's the closest they get. And it was very close to their recognizing the Confederacy. But the introduction of emancipation as one of the aims of the war puts them on the sidelines and leaves them there for the rest of the war. The other thing that emancipation winds up doing is that it does rob the South of a lot of its labor force. I mean, obviously all 4 million slaves did not up and leave, but you have slaves, as soon as the armies get within, get close enough, they run to the Union Army lines. And the South is depleted of its labor force. And the reason that all these white men could be in the Southern Army was because the slaves were at home producing the food and manning the factories and doing all this work. Okay.
Jenny, we have one question from Seward County Community College before I call us off and encourage you all to go and buy a copy of Copperheads on your way out. And I think you're going to know the answer to this because I've read your book. How critical was the vote of Union soldiers in the election of 1864? That's from Doug Brown out in Liberal.
Okay. Lincoln would have won without the soldier vote. But 82% of the soldiers voted for Lincoln, which I think is an important statement of where the soldiers were. And one of the interesting things that you see happening over the course of the war is that the soldiers start feeling that they have earned the right to tell the people at home, including their fathers, their uncles, their neighbors, how to vote. Age is not the issue now. It's they have earned the right to weigh in hard on how this election should go. And so you see hundreds and hundreds of soldier letters saying, vote for Lincoln. If you care at all about me, if you care at all about what I have been doing for the past 3 or 4 years, you will vote for Lincoln. And if you don't, I will never speak with you again. And they don't. I mean, they mean it. And they talk about going home and attacking Copperheads as soon as they get home. And many of them carry through on their threats. They are really serious. They're very angry at the Copperheads.
Fantastic. Will you all join me in thanking Jenny Weber for bringing our lecture series to such a successful close?